The candles in the Ashworth ballroom burned in clusters of 12, and someone, not Eleanor, had counted them beforehand to ensure the effect was uniform. 300 guests moved beneath the chandeliers, in a choreography so practiced it resembled weather, each current predictable, each eddy explained by title or fortune, or the arrangement of the supper tables. Lady Ashworth had spent 11 weeks planning the evening. Her daughter, Miss Cecilia Ashworth, wore white silk trimmed with seed pearls, and the room understood, without being told, that this was a presentation as much as a party. The orchestra played in the East Gallery. The flowers, hothouse roses, blush and cream, had been arranged in the alcoves by someone whose name no one thought to ask. And at the edge of all that calculated splendor, seated at the writing desk beside the morning room door, reviewing the seating arrangements for the third time that evening, was Eleanor Voss. She wore grey. The dress was 3 years old, and had been let out once at the seams, but it was clean and pressed, and she had done both the pressing and the letting out herself, before dawn, because the maid assigned to the guest rooms had been needed in the kitchens. Eleanor had not mentioned this to anyone. There was no one to mention it to, and mentioning it would have changed nothing. She picked up her pencil and drew a line through Colonel Hartley's name, moved him 2 seats toward the window to accommodate Lady Pemberton's hearing, and wrote the correction in her small, even hand. She noticed the Duke of Rolleston before the room did. The room noticed him a half-second later, a ripple through the nearest cluster of guests, a slight turning of heads, the way sound changes when something enters that has weight. Tristan Vane, the 6th Duke of Rolleston, was 34 years old, dark-coated, and moved through the Ashworth ballroom as a man completes an obligation he has already discharged in his mind. He did not smile at the chandeliers. He did not pause to admire Miss Cecilia Ashworth's seed pearls, though she had positioned herself within 10 feet of the entrance with the precise intention that he should. He handed his card to the footman without looking at it. Eleanor watched him cross the room. She was invisible to most of what was happening around her, and she was accustomed to that invisibility, the way a person is accustomed to a room with low ceilings, not with bitterness, but with a careful calibration of where she placed her head. She watched the Duke because he moved differently from the other men in the room, and she had learned, in 8 years of managing other people's houses, that how a person moves through a space tells you what they think the space requires of them. He was halfway across the floor when he stopped. He stopped because he had seen the writing desk. More specifically, he had seen the seating chart spread across it, and the pencil in her hand, and the correction she was in the process of making. Eleanor kept writing. She was aware of his attention the way she was aware of a draft from an incorrectly latched window, as a change in the air, a thing requiring minor adjustment. She finished the correction, blotted the pencil mark, and looked up. The Duke of Rolleston was watching her, with the particular attention of a man who has just encountered something he did not expect, and is deciding what to do about it. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply looked, for the space of 3 deliberate seconds, and then continued across the room toward his host. Eleanor returned to the seating chart. She moved Sir Albert Colmore 1 seat to the left, to prevent him from being placed beside his estranged brother, a detail Lady Ashworth had not noticed and would not notice, and drew a small, clean arrow in the margin. She had not come to the Ashworth ball to be noticed. She had come because Lady Ashworth's niece, Mrs. Penelope Ward, employed Eleanor as a household secretary, and Mrs. Ward had required someone to manage the logistical particulars of an event her aunt could not be trusted to arrange without incident. Eleanor had managed 9 dinner parties, 4 card evenings, 2 charitable assemblies, and 1 extremely complicated shooting party in the 18 months she had been with Mrs. Ward. She was very good at this work. No one had ever told her so, but the evidence was in the absence of disasters, and Eleanor had learned to read absence as fluently as presence. She drew a second line through the arrangement at table 4, rewrote it from scratch, and did not look up again. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. Eleanor's father had been a country solicitor in Wiltshire, methodical and kind, who had taught her Latin at 8, account-keeping at 10, and the management of a household ledger at 13, on the grounds that a woman who understood numbers could not be easily deceived. He died of a fever when Eleanor was 17, and within 6 weeks her uncle, Mr. Gerald Voss, had arrived from London with a set of opinions about the estate that Eleanor did not share and could not legally contest. The estate was not large, a modest house, 4 tenant farms, a wool merchant's annual agreement that her father had renewed faithfully each September for 19 years. What it required was not brilliance but consistency, the accounts kept current, the tenant repairs addressed before they became structural failures, the wool merchant's figures checked against the delivery records, so that the margin was not quietly absorbed by the merchant's own arithmetic. Eleanor's father had done all of this himself, with Eleanor beside him for the final 3 years of his life. She had sat at his desk, held the same pen, read the same ledgers. She understood the estate the way she understood her own hands. Gerald Voss understood the estate as an asset he now controlled. He moved into the house, assigned Eleanor to the role of household secretary, with no salary and no title, and proceeded to make a series of decisions that Eleanor watched with the steady attention of someone watching a bridge being incorrectly repaired. She documented each one. She kept a second ledger, her own, which she maintained in her bedroom under the loose floorboard her father had shown her when she was 12, the same place he had kept the original deed. She did not tell Gerald about the second ledger. She also did not tell him that she had identified, in the September delivery records, an ongoing discrepancy in the wool merchant's measurements that amounted to £18 annually, a figure her father had apparently missed, and that Eleanor corrected quietly, in the first year, by writing the merchant a precise letter outlining the arithmetic and requesting adjustment. The merchant adjusted. The £18 went into the estate account. Gerald Voss spent it on a new coat and did not notice where it had come from. She managed the 4 tenant farms through 2 dry summers and 1 flooding autumn. She renegotiated the winter fuel supply when the usual merchant increased his price by 15%, found an alternative supplier in the next county, and reduced the household fuel cost by £9 in the first year. She hired the new kitchen maid, dismissed the footman who had been stealing from the pantry, and arranged the repair of the east wall before the crack reached the foundation. She did all of this between the hours of 5 in the morning and 8, when Gerald was still asleep, and again between 9 at night and 11, when he had retired to the drawing room with his brandy and his opinions. Gerald Voss told people his niece was useful for the household. 4 years passed in this fashion. Eleanor turned 21, and then 22, and then 23, and the law confirmed what she had already understood, that the estate was her uncle's, that she had no claim, and that the work she was doing was charity, not employment. She allowed herself, on the night of her 23rd birthday, a single hour of what she would not call despair, but which occupied the same geography. She sat at the window of her bedroom and looked at the dark field beyond the garden, and she understood that she was going to be here when she was 30 and 40, and that the estate would continue to function because of her, and Gerald would continue to receive the credit for it, and this would be her life. She was not going to accept that. She did not arrive at this conclusion with drama. It settled over her the way a practical decision settles, not suddenly, but as the conclusion of a chain of reasoning she had been following for some time. She was not going to become less than she was. She was going to find a way out that did not require anyone's permission. 3 months later, through a connection her father had maintained with a retired magistrate in Bath, she obtained the position with Mrs. Penelope Ward. She packed 1 trunk, said goodbye to no one. Gerald was in London and had forgotten she lived there, and took the mail coach to Bath on a Tuesday morning in March, with £11 in her purse, and the second ledger tucked between her spare dress and the Latin grammar her father had given her. She was 23 years old. She intended to survive. In the 18 months since, She had made herself indispensable to Mrs. Ward, in the same way she had made herself indispensable to the Voss estate. By doing the work completely, documenting it precisely, and solving the problems before they became visible enough to require someone else's intervention. She had organized Mrs. Ward's finances sufficiently to identify that the household was overpaying its wine merchant by £32 annually and its linen supplier by 12. She had drafted 3 letters of negotiation in Mrs. Ward's name, which Mrs. Ward had signed without reading carefully, and had recovered £44 in the first year. Mrs. Ward attributed this improvement to good fortune and her own improved housekeeping. Eleanor had returned to her ledger and written down the figure. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. On the night of the Ashworth ball, Eleanor finished her corrections to the seating arrangements at 9:30, delivered the revised chart to the head footman with brief, specific instructions, and retreated to the morning room with a cup of tea that was already cold. She sat with her notebook and began working through the guest list for Mrs. Ward's November dinner, which was 6 weeks away, and already showing signs of structural difficulty in the form of 2 feuding cousins and a question about the fish supplier's reliability since his assistant had left. She was halfway through a potential solution when she became aware that someone had sat down in the chair across from her. She looked up. The Duke of Rolleston set his champagne glass on the table beside him and said, without preamble, "You moved Sir Albert Colmore 2 seats to the left." Eleanor looked at him with the even attention she brought to every problem. "I did," she said. "He and his brother have not spoken since their father's will was settled. Placing them adjacent would have produced an incident before the fish course." The Duke said nothing for a moment. He looked at her notebook, the pencil in her hand, the cup of cold tea beside her. He said, "How long have you been managing this household's arrangements?" "I am employed by Mrs. Ward," Eleanor said. "I have been with her for 18 months. I assist with Lady Ashworth's events as needed." "And before Mrs. Ward?" It was an unusual question for a ballroom introduction, and Eleanor noted this without alarm. "I managed my uncle's estate in Wiltshire," she said, "for 4 years." The Duke looked at her with the measuring attention he had turned on her across the ballroom floor. "Voss," he said. It was not a question. He had read the seating chart. "Eleanor Voss," she confirmed. He picked up his champagne glass, considered it, set it down again. "You are not enjoying the ball," he observed. "I am not a guest at the ball," she said. "I am working." He looked at her, as though this answer had confirmed something he had been uncertain about. He stood, inclined his head, not a bow, but an acknowledgement, precise and deliberate, and returned to the ballroom. Eleanor returned to the November dinner problem. She had learned not to expect anything from conversations that went nowhere. She picked up her pencil and wrote the name of the alternative fish supplier she had identified 3 weeks ago. She did not allow herself to think about the way the Duke had looked at her seating chart, or the specific quality of his attention, which had felt less like the attention most people gave a household secretary, and more like the attention her father had given a problem he intended to solve. She picked up her list and continued. Tristan Vane had been the Duke of Rolleston for 6 years, since the death of his father, and he had done his research before attending the Ashworth ball. Not about the Ashworths. Miss Cecilia Ashworth required no research. Her credentials had been communicated to him through 3 separate social channels, with the efficiency of a military dispatch. He had done his research about something else, something he had been piecing together for several weeks, beginning with a report from Mr. Edward Fairweather, the retired solicitor who had served Rolleston's legal affairs for 30 years. Fairweather was 71, precise, and had the quality that Tristan valued above most things, which was that he reported what he found, rather than what he thought the Duke wished to hear. He had been engaged, 6 weeks earlier, to look into a particular matter concerning the Voss estate in Wiltshire. Not because Tristan had any interest in Wiltshire solicitors' estates, but because he had a problem at Rolleston that he could not solve from inside it, and Fairweather had mentioned, in passing, that the most competent household management he had encountered in the past decade had been executed by an unpaid niece in a 3-room estate office outside Marlborough. Tristan's problem was Ralston itself. The dukedom was solvent, barely, by the measures that mattered, but its management had been eroding for the 15 years before his father's death, a slow structural decay that Tristan had spent his first 6 years attempting to arrest with the tools available to him. He had good people. He had James Whitmore, his estate steward, who was honest and capable within the limits of what he had been taught. He had Fairweather. He had a household that ran adequately. What he did not have was anyone who could see the whole of it, the connections between the tenant-farm agreements and the seasonal supply contracts and the household accounts and the merchant relationships as a single system. What he needed was someone who thought in structures, who saw problems before they became visible, who did not require him to translate the question before they understood it. Fairweather had given him Eleanor Voss's name in September. By October, Tristan had read the account of her work in Wiltshire, the recovered wool merchant margin, the fuel supply renegotiation, the tenant repairs, the wall, and recognised, with the specific identification of a man who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it, that this was the person his estate needed. The difficulty was that Eleanor Voss was a woman, unmarried, and held no formal position in anything. He had stood in the corridor outside Mrs. Ward's morning room on 3 consecutive Tuesday evenings, when Fairweather had reported that she worked late on the household accounts, listening to the scratch of her pencil and the occasional sound of a page turning. He had not done this to observe her. He had done it because he needed to understand, before he made any approach, what kind of person she was when she thought no one was listening. On the first Tuesday, she worked steadily for 2 hours, with no interruption, rose at 10:30, and extinguished the lamp. On the second Tuesday, she found a discrepancy. He heard the pencil stop, heard her set it down, heard the sound of a second ledger being opened and cross-referenced, heard the quiet confirmation when the numbers resolved, and then continued without making any comment to anyone. On the third Tuesday, she played the piano for 20 minutes, not well in the sense of performance, but with the specific attention of someone working through something that mattered to her. A simple piece, careful and unhurried, the kind of playing that has no audience in mind. He did not know why this last detail stayed with him in a way the ledgers had not. He stood in the corridor with his hand braced against the wall and listened until she finished, and then he walked back to his carriage and sat in the dark for several minutes before instructing the driver to proceed. He attended the Ashworth ball because Fairweather had mentioned that Mrs. Ward would be present with her household secretary. He had not planned to speak to her. He had planned to observe. He had not planned on the seating chart. He had not planned on the quality of her answer, the absence of apology, the direct naming of the problem and the solution, the complete lack of performance in it. He had spoken to her for 4 minutes in a morning room, while a ball proceeded without her, and he had understood, in the plain language of a man who values precision above decoration, that he was going to make Eleanor Voss an offer, and that the offer was going to be of genuine work, with genuine terms, and that everything else would follow from there. He did not know, yet, what the everything else would look like. He held this uncertainty with the same still attention with which he held most things, and did not permit it to become a problem before it was ready to be solved. He arranged, through Fairweather, to be introduced to Mrs. Ward at the Bath Assembly 3 days later. He presented the proposal in formal terms. Ralston required a household secretary of exceptional capability. The position would carry a genuine salary, £120 annually, with residence at the estate, and he understood that Mrs. Ward employed a person of exactly the right qualifications. He offered Mrs. Ward a handsome letter of recommendation for her next secretary and 6 months' salary as a transition consideration. Mrs. Ward, who had been trying to reduce household costs since December, accepted within 48 hours. Eleanor learned of this arrangement when Mrs. Ward called her into the morning room, and told her, with the pleasantly distracted air of a woman delivering news she considered good, that Eleanor had been engaged by the Duke of Rolleston and would need to be ready to travel to Rolleston Park in Derbyshire within a fortnight. Eleanor said, "I see." She kept her hands still in her lap. She asked 2 questions: the salary, and whether she would have access to the estate accounts directly. Mrs. Ward repeated the salary. The second question went unanswered because Mrs. Ward did not know the answer, which told Eleanor something. She returned to her room and sat with the information for a full hour before she opened her notebook and began writing the list of things she would need to know before she arrived. Rolleston Park was older than it looked from the drive, which itself looked very old. Grey stone, symmetrical in the manner of a house that had been added to twice and then restrained by someone who understood proportion. The grounds in late October were stripped to their bones, the elms bare, the kitchen garden cut back to root level, the long grass on the south side silver with frost. At 8 in the morning, when Eleanor's carriage arrived, she noted the condition of the east wall along the kitchen garden as she passed. A crack, familiar in its character, not yet structural. She made a note. A maid named Rosie Alcott met her at the servants' entrance with a directness Eleanor immediately recognized as the absence of performance rather than rudeness. Rosie was perhaps 20, with quick eyes and a way of showing Eleanor the house that presumed she would want to see the utility of a thing rather than its decoration. She pointed out the linen cupboard, the location of the household records, the steward's office, and the butler's pantry in one efficient circuit, then stopped in the corridor outside the estate office and said, "The accounts are in there. His Grace asked that they be made available to you." Eleanor looked at her. He specified that. "Yesterday morning," Rosie said. "He told Mr. Whitmore directly." Eleanor opened the estate office door and looked at the shelves. 12 years of accounts, organised by year, the recent volumes showing the slightly too thick spine of a ledger that has been receiving entries from multiple hands without a single editor. She recognised the particular exhaustion of an accounting system that had never been rationalised. She took the most recent 3 volumes off the shelf, set them on the desk, and began. The first problem she found took 40 minutes to locate and was not, in itself, alarming. A double-counted delivery in the autumn supply agreements that had inflated one quarterly total by £14. The second problem was more interesting. The wool tenant on the northern farm, Caldwell's, was recording yields that did not align with the acreage figures in the original farm agreement, a discrepancy that, followed back through 4 years of records, amounted to a quiet underreporting of production that had reduced the estate's income by approximately £60 annually. Someone had been receiving the difference, and it was not the estate. Eleanor documented this without expression, cross-referenced it against the land survey she found in the bottom drawer, and added it to the list that was developing in her notebook, with the clean velocity of a problem being properly understood for the first time. She worked through until noon without stopping. She met James Whitmore, the estate steward, at 1 o'clock, when he knocked on the office door with an expression that was attempting neutrality and not entirely achieving it. He was 52, Eleanor estimated, experienced in the honest sense of having managed this estate for 18 years, and visibly uncertain what the arrival of a household secretary from Bath was supposed to mean for the scope of his work. Eleanor understood this uncertainty and did not address it directly. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, I have found a discrepancy in the Caldwell farm records. I would like to discuss it with you before I bring it to the Duke." Whitmore came into the room and looked at the ledgers she had open on the desk. He looked at her annotations. He said, slowly, "I noticed something similar last spring. Did you document it?" A pause. Informally. "Would you share your notes with me?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a person deciding whether to trust someone they have just met. Then he nodded and left to retrieve the notes, and Eleanor understood that this was going to be a workable arrangement. Charlotte Pierce found her that afternoon. Charlotte was the Duke's widowed cousin, 30 years old, resident at Ralston Park for the past 2 years, in the comfortable orbit of a family connection that provided room and board in exchange for occasional social assistance. She arrived at the estate office door with a plate of cold meats and a look of frank curiosity that Eleanor found, after 18 months of Mrs. Ward's pleasant vagueness, almost startling in its clarity. "I have been wondering about you since Tuesday," Charlotte said, setting the plate on the corner of the desk. "Edward Fairweather told me you were remarkable, and Fairweather does not use the word lightly. He once described the Treaty of Amiens as adequately structured." Eleanor looked at the plate and recognized that she had not eaten since the journey. She took a piece of bread and said, "Mr. Fairweather is kind. He is accurate," Charlotte said, sitting in the chair on the far side of the desk, without being invited, which Eleanor also found she did not mind. "Has Tristan, His Grace, spoken to you yet?" "Not since my arrival." Charlotte tilted her head. "He knows you are here. He has been in the library since 9 this morning, which means he is thinking about something he is not ready to address." Eleanor found this piece of information useful in a way she was not certain she wanted to examine. "I will have a preliminary account of my findings for him by the end of the week," she said. Charlotte looked at the 3 open ledgers and the notebook covered in Eleanor's small, dense annotations. "I see," she said, in a tone that suggested she saw considerably more than the ledgers. "I will come back tomorrow and you can tell me whether Rosie has managed to get you a room that isn't directly above the kitchen fire." She had not. Eleanor moved to a room on the 2nd floor before the week was out, after a quiet word with Whitmore, who arranged it without drama. She met the Duke on the 4th day. He came to the estate office at 7 in the morning, before Whitmore had arrived, before Rosie had brought the coal. Eleanor was at the desk in her coat because the fire was still being laid, with the 4th ledger open and her notebook beside it. He knocked, she noted this, that he knocked on the door of an office that was nominally his, and came in and stood for a moment, looking at the state of the desk. "You have been here early," he said. "The light is better before the household begins moving," Eleanor said. "Also, the quiet." He looked at her notebook, which was open to the page of Caldwell Farm figures. He said, "You found the yield discrepancy." "On the first day," she said. Mr. Whitmore had noted it informally. "Between his notes and the land survey, the arithmetic is clear enough." Tristan took the chair across the desk, which was the same positioning as the morning room in Bath, and which Eleanor found herself noticing. He said, "What is the figure?" £60 annually for 4 years. Approximately £240 total, less any adjustment for variation in wool prices. The more immediate concern is the double count in the autumn supply agreements. That is £14 in the current quarter and should be recovered from the supplier directly. I have drafted a letter. She passed him the draft letter. He read it. He read it in full, which most of the men she had worked for would not have done. He said, "This is well constructed. Thank you." He set the letter down and looked at her with the measuring attention she was beginning to understand as simply how he looked at things he was considering carefully. "Have you found anything else?" 11 items of varying severity, she said. "I would like another week before I present them formally, so I can verify the figures against the source documents." He nodded once. He picked up the letter again, read the second paragraph, and said, "Change oversight to discrepancy in the 3rd line. Oversight implies error. Discrepancy implies pattern." Eleanor looked at the letter. She took the letter back and changed the word. She was aware, in the way she was aware of the draft from the not quite latched window, that this was the first time since her father that someone had edited her work with the intention of making it better rather than managing its existence. She returned the letter. He stood, took it, and said, "1 week, then." He was at the door when he stopped and said, without turning, "The room above the kitchen fire is not suitable. I trust it has been corrected." "It has," Eleanor said. He left. Eleanor looked at the corrected letter for a moment, then opened her notebook to the next item on the list. She did not allow herself to count what had just happened. It was too early for counting. She returned to the ledger and continued. The days settled into a rhythm that Eleanor would not have called peaceful. There was too much work for peaceful, but that had a quality of rightness she did not examine too closely. She worked in the estate office until noon, walked the grounds with Whitmore in the early afternoon to see the conditions of the farms and the outbuildings, and returned to the desk until 6. After supper, she often worked another hour in the library, which was warmer than the estate office, and where the Duke also worked, on the far side of a large oak table, in a silence that had ceased, by the second week, to feel like proximity, and had begun to feel like company. He brought her a second lamp without being asked, on the 8th evening, setting it beside her work without comment. She noticed that his cravat was crooked, had been crooked, she realized, for the better part of 40 minutes. She considered this for a moment. Then she set down her pencil, rose from her chair, crossed the 12 feet between their desks, and straightened it with 2 precise adjustments, her fingers quick and certain. She stepped back. "It has been crooked for 40 minutes, she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was not surprise exactly, but its quieter cousin. He said, "Why did you wait 40 minutes?" "I was finishing a calculation," she said, and returned to her desk. She was almost certain she heard, a sound from across the room that was not quite a laugh, but occupied its immediate vicinity. She picked up her pencil and did not look up. 3 days before she was to present her formal account of findings to the Duke, Lady Sylvia Montrose arrived at Ralston Park with her mother, Lady Montrose, and an understanding, communicated through the social architecture of the county, rather than through any stated agreement, that she was the most probable future Duchess of Ralston. She was 26, beautiful in the precise, finished way of a woman who has been told since childhood that beauty is her primary currency and has invested accordingly. She wore a travelling dress of deep blue that cost more than Eleanor's annual salary, and moved through Ralston's entrance hall with the ease of a person who has already decided the space belongs to her. She encountered Eleanor in the corridor outside the morning room, on the second morning, as Eleanor was carrying 3 volumes of the supply contracts to the estate office. Lady Sylvia looked at her, looked at the ledgers, and said, with pleasant condescension, "Are you the new secretary? I understand His Grace has engaged someone from Bath." "I am," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Ward's household secretary." "Yes." Lady Sylvia's tone placed this information in a category slightly below the housekeeper and slightly above the laundry arrangements. "I suppose there is a great deal of accounting to be done." "A considerable amount," Eleanor said. Lady Sylvia smiled, which was a different action from what most people meant when they used the word. "I wouldn't keep you then," she said, and moved past her into the morning room. Eleanor continued to the estate office. She set the supply contracts on the desk, opened the first volume, and noted, in the margin of her working notebook, that she had now met the expected woman, who was not cruel, but was a system that had been running for centuries, and ran very smoothly, and had no intention of accommodating disruption. Eleanor had been a disruption in most of the rooms she had occupied for the past 8 years. She knew how to work beside a system without confronting it before the evidence was ready. She picked up her pencil and returned to the supply contracts. The formal presentation was on a Thursday. Whitmore was present, and Fairweather, who had travelled from Bath specifically, and, Eleanor had not anticipated this, Lord Reginald Vane, Tristan's father's younger brother, and the person who managed the estate's London financial arrangements. Lord Reginald was 63, silver-haired, and regarded Eleanor across the table with the polite, comprehensive dismissal of a man who has decided before he arrived that whatever he is about to hear is not going to require him to change anything. Eleanor had laid the accounts across the table in order of severity. She had a summary document, 12 items, each with the specific figure, the source ledger reference, and the recommended action, and she had the underlying documentation supporting each one. She had also, in the week since she drafted the Caldwell letter, completed a broader analysis of the estate's supply agreements and found 2 additional overcharges and 1 expired contract that had been automatically renewed at the old, unfavourable rate. She presented without preface. Item 1. The Caldwell yield discrepancy, £240 over 4 years. Item 2. The supply agreement overcharges, combined £47 in the current year. Item 3. The expired wool contract, renewable on improved terms that would recover £62 annually going forward. Lord Reginald said, midway through Item 3, these figures are estimates. They are documented calculations, Eleanor said, without changing her tone. The documentation is in the second column. The Caldwell figures are supported by the Land Survey of 1819 and the Farm Agreement of 1817. The supply overcharges are supported by the original invoices and the delivery receipts. The contract renewal figure is based on the current market rate, which I have obtained from 2 comparable estates in the county. You have obtained figures from neighbouring estates, Lord Reginald said, with a precision that was intended to sound like scepticism. From their stewards, Eleanor said. Mr. Whitmore facilitated the introductions. She looked at Whitmore, who confirmed this with a single nod. If the methodology is in question, I am glad to walk through each calculation individually. I have the working papers. She did not add anything else. She had found, in 8 years of presenting information to men who found it inconvenient, that additional words were a form of apology, and she was not apologizing. Fairweather, from the end of the table, said, in the dry, settled voice of a man who has been waiting for this moment, the methodology is sound. I reviewed the Caldwell calculations myself on Tuesday. The figures are accurate. Lord Reginald looked at Fairweather, then at Tristan, who was sitting at the head of the table, and had not spoken. Tristan said, Miss Voss, continue. She continued. Items 4 through 12. The smallest was £3 and a misallocated repair cost. The largest was a pattern of commission payments to a London agent who appeared to be representing both the estate and the London merchant simultaneously, a conflict she had not yet fully traced, but which had cost the estate an estimated £80 in the last year in unnecessary fees. The room was quiet when she finished. Lord Reginald said, The commission agent matter is a serious accusation. It is a documented pattern, Eleanor said. I have not made an accusation. I have presented the records. The interpretation requires a legal opinion. She looked at Fairweather, which I understand Mr. Fairweather is qualified to provide. Fairweather, with the faint expression of a man who approves of how someone has handled a room, opened his own copy of the summary document and placed it precisely in front of him. It does, he said. I will begin the review this week. Lord Reginald sat for a moment with the expression of a man who is recalculating something he believed was settled. He looked at the summary document, at the figures Eleanor had laid out with the patient precision of someone who had anticipated every objection and built the evidence to precede it. He said nothing further. After the meeting, as Eleanor was collecting her documentation, Tristan stopped beside her desk and said, in a voice too low for Whitmore, who was still present, to hear clearly, The commission agent matter. How long have you known? I identified the pattern on Tuesday, Eleanor said. I did not present it earlier because I had only 3 transactions confirmed. I now have 7. I needed 7 to make the documentation conclusive. He looked at the papers in her hands. You were waiting for certainty, he said. I was waiting for enough, she said. There is a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, in the tone of a man who means considerably more than the single syllable carries, and left the room. Lady Montrose made her move on the following Saturday, at the dinner Tristan had arranged for the county families, a gathering of 8 couples that Lady Sylvia's presence had elevated, in the social arithmetic of Derbyshire into something more legible. Eleanor was not a guest at this dinner. She had organised the menu, confirmed the seating, and resolved a last-minute difficulty with the wine delivery that required a rapid substitution from the estate cellar. She was in the kitchen at 6:30 when Rosie appeared with the expression of someone carrying news they have been asked to deliver and are not entirely comfortable delivering. "Lady Montrose is asking whether the secretary has been invited to table," Rosie said. "She was speaking to the housekeeper, but I think it was meant to be heard." Eleanor understood the question precisely. It was not a question about Eleanor's comfort. It was a question about Eleanor's position, a public calibration of where she stood in relation to what Lady Montrose was planning. She said, "I am not a guest. I am working." Lady Montrose also said, Rosie continued, with the careful diction of someone reciting an exact quote, that she supposed the accounts required constant supervision, given how recently the situation had been discovered. This was not about the accounts. This was about Eleanor's competence being reframed as a cause of the problem rather than its remedy. Eleanor recognized the maneuver, the way she recognized an incorrect entry in a ledger, by its specific departure from what the record actually showed. She said, "Please tell Mrs. Alcott that the wine substitution for the third course is the 1814 Bordeaux, second shelf from the left in the east cellar. There are 7 bottles. That is sufficient for the table." "Yes, Miss Voss." Eleanor returned to the kitchen and continued. Tristan found her there 40 minutes later. He came through the kitchen corridor with the particular quality of purposefulness she had come to associate with him. Not urgency, but commitment. The way a man moves when he has already decided what he is going to do and is in the process of executing it. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at Eleanor with the wine list in her hand and the housekeeper beside her, and said, "Miss Voss, a moment." They stood in the corridor, which was not private exactly, but was away from the kitchen noise. He said, "Lady Montrose's comment was reported to me." "It was not material to the dinner arrangements," Eleanor said. "It was material to other things," he said. He looked at her with the steady attention that she understood now was not assessment. He had finished assessing, she thought, some weeks ago, but something more difficult to name. "I want you to know that the work you have presented is being implemented, all 12 items. Fairweather has already begun the legal review of the commission matter. Whitmore is meeting with Caldwell's tenant on Monday." Eleanor looked at him. "I know," she said. "I have been coordinating with both of them." Something moved through his expression that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but contained elements of both. He said, "Of course you have." He looked at the wall beside her, then back at her face. He said, "You should not be in the kitchen at this hour." The wine substitution needed to be confirmed. "It is confirmed. Go to the library. I will have supper sent." She looked at him for a moment, the consideration she brought to every significant decision, measured and honest. She said, "The dinner will not run itself. It has a housekeeper, a butler, and 2 footmen," he said. "It will manage for one evening without your direct oversight." He paused. "Please." She had not heard him use that word before. She went to the library. The supper was cold chicken and bread, and a glass of the 1814 Bordeaux, brought by Rosie, with the specific expression of someone who has just been asked to do something they find unexpectedly satisfying. Eleanor sat with it and her notebook, and worked for an hour, and was aware, the entire hour, that she was in a warm room with wine and food, and that someone had arranged this specifically for her, which was a thing she had not experienced for a number of years, and which she was not entirely certain how to hold. She pressed one hand briefly against the wall beside her chair, a steadying, and returned to her work. He came to the library at 10 o'clock, after the dinner guests had departed. He was still in his evening coat, the cravat, she was relieved to note, entirely straight, which suggested he had checked it after their previous encounter. He sat at his usual place across the table and opened his correspondence and worked beside her for an hour without speaking, which was itself a form of speech she had learned to read. At 11, he looked up from a letter and said, without transition, "My mother played the piano." Eleanor looked up from her ledger. "She died when I was 14, he said. "She had a piece she played in the evenings. I could never remember the name of it." He looked at the letter in his hands, then set it down. "I heard you playing, in Bath, on the third Tuesday evening. There is a composition by Dussek. She played it. The one you were working through. I recognized it." Eleanor was still. She understood, now, why he had hired her, and she understood that the understanding was larger and more complicated than she had space for in this moment. And she sat with it, the way she sat with a set of figures she had not yet finished reading. She said, "I am sorry you lost her." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him, not the measuring attention, not the precision, but something quieter and less constructed. He said, "She would have liked what you did with the commission records." Eleanor thought about this. She thought about a woman she had never met who had played Dussek in the evenings and would apparently have appreciated a well-documented discrepancy, and she found that this was the most genuinely comforting thing anyone had said to her in a long time. She said, "That is the kindest thing you have told me." They worked until midnight. The county assembly at the Holsworth Rooms, 3 weeks into December, was where it happened. Eleanor was not invited. This was not cruelty. She was not the class of person who received invitations to Holsworth assemblies, but she was present in the corridor outside the anteroom at 8 in the evening because Fairweather had sent word that afternoon that the commission agent matter had developed. New evidence, 3 additional transactions, and the involvement of a second party who turned out to be the estate's own London solicitor, a man named Berwick, who had been practicing a very quiet double commission arrangement for not 6 years but 11. Fairweather had the documents. He would be at the assembly because he lived 4 doors from the Holsworth Rooms and attended as a matter of civil habit. Eleanor needed to see the documents before they were presented formally. She met Fairweather in the anteroom at 8:15. He gave her the documents. She sat at the small table in the corner and read them in 15 minutes, and the arithmetic was exactly what she had suspected, and considerably worse. She was making her summary notes when Lady Sylvia Montrose entered the anteroom. Lady Sylvia was in ivory silk. She looked at Eleanor, at the papers, the notebook, the pencil, with an expression that moved through surprise and settled in something colder. "You are not a guest here," she said. "I am not," Eleanor said. "I am reviewing documents." "In the anteroom of a county assembly." Lady Sylvia's voice carried the precision of a woman who knows how to use a room's acoustics. The inner door to the assembly hall was not entirely closed. The sounds of conversation and the first movement of the orchestra drifted through. "I think most people would consider this an extraordinary imposition." Eleanor looked at the document in her hand, then at Lady Sylvia. "I think most people have not yet seen what these documents show," she said. "When they do, I expect the question of whether a household secretary reviewed them in an anteroom will seem considerably less urgent." Lady Sylvia looked at the papers. Something shifted in her expression, not admiration, but a recalibration of the landscape. She said, "What do they show?" "That the estate's London solicitor has been collecting unauthorised commissions for 11 years, Eleanor said, "from both the estate and the counterparties. The figure is significant." Lady Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Eleanor watched her, with the specific patience of a woman who has made her calculation and is waiting for the arithmetic to finish presenting itself. Lady Sylvia said, slowly, "Does Tristan know?" "He will," Eleanor said. "Tonight." There was a pause. Then Lady Sylvia turned and went back through the inner door without another word. Eleanor returned to her summary notes. She finished them at 8:20 and asked the footman by the door whether he would inform the Duke of Rolleston that Miss Voss required a brief word when his schedule permitted. Tristan arrived in 4 minutes. He looked at her summary notes. He looked at the documents. His expression did not change, but his posture changed. The specific alignment of a man who has been waiting for a piece of information and has now received it. He said, 11 years. Beginning in the last year of your father's tenure, Eleanor said. The first transaction is dated April 1809. Berwick began when the estate was in enough financial difficulty that the audit attention was focused elsewhere. He continued because no one was looking at the London transactions and the estate accounts simultaneously. Until you did. Until I did. She handed him the summary. Fairweather has the legal analysis. He recommends immediate suspension of Berwick's authority and a formal demand letter this week. The documentation is sufficient to support a civil action if you choose to pursue it. Tristan read the summary. He read it completely. He held the document for a moment, and Eleanor watched him in the way she had come to watch him, with an attention she did not name but which was, she understood, no longer purely professional. He had done something for her, over the past 6 weeks, that no one had done since her father. He had treated the work as real, and therefore treated her as real, and these two things had turned out to be the same thing. He lowered the document and looked at her. "Come inside," he said. She said, "I am not a guest." "You are," he said. "Whatever I say you are." He paused. "Come inside. I need you to present this." Eleanor looked at him. The assembly was audible through the door. The orchestra, the conversation, the particular density of a county gathering in December. Lord Reginald was inside. Lady Montrose was inside. The assembled machinery of a social world that had its own opinions about where Eleanor Voss was permitted to stand was inside. She straightened her spine, picked up the summary document and the 3 most critical source pages, and followed him through the door. The assembly hall at Halsworth was smaller than the Ashworth ballroom, but more densely packed. 60 people in a room meant for 50, the candles burning high, the conversation loud. Tristan crossed the room with Eleanor beside him, and the room noticed the ripple, the head turning, the specific recalibration of attention that happens when someone brings an unexpected person into an expected space. Eleanor walked beside him, with her documents held against her side, and her eyes on the point she was heading toward. Lord Reginald was standing near the fireplace with 2 other men Eleanor recognised from the estate accounts, members of the county investment circle that managed certain Ralston financial instruments. Tristan stopped in front of them. He said, without preface, "I need 5 minutes. Miss Voss has something you need to see." Lord Reginald looked at Eleanor. He looked at the papers in her hand. He said, with the particular restraint of a man who has already revised his opinion once and is not eager to do so again, "This is a social occasion." "It will be brief," Eleanor said. She set the 3 source pages on the side table beside the fireplace, arranged them in order, and presented the commission structure in the same manner she had presented everything else, without preface, without appeal, with the documents doing the work that documents are designed to do. She said, "These are 3 transactions from 1811, 1813, and 1815. In each case, Berwick received a commission from the counterparty that is not reflected in the estate's payment records. The counterparty's invoices, which I obtained from the original correspondence files, show a line item labelled Introduction Fee in figures consistent across all 11 years. The total figure, calculated against the complete transaction record, is £412. The 2 investment circle men looked at the documents. They looked at each other. Lord Reginald picked up the 1813 page. He read it. He set it down and picked up the 1815 page. He was quiet for a moment. That was longer than most pauses in a conversation. A pause with weight and texture. The pause of a man arriving somewhere he had not intended to arrive. He said, "Finally, this is Berwick's handwriting on the correspondence. The initials are consistent with his other letters in the estate files," Eleanor said. Fairweather has confirmed the authentication. The room around them had not yet understood what was happening, but it understood that something was happening. The quality of stillness near the fireplace was different from the rest of the room, and stillness at a social gathering is its own signal. Charlotte Pierce had appeared at Eleanor's left shoulder, present and watchful in the way of someone who has come to bear witness. Rosie was not in the room, but Eleanor felt, in some sense she could not entirely account for, that she was not alone. Lord Reginald set the 1815 page down. He looked at Eleanor, not with warmth, not with the complete conversion of a man who has seen the error of everything he previously believed, but with the honest, imperfect reckoning of a man who has looked at evidence and cannot disagree with it. He said, "You found this." "I found it in the records," Eleanor said. "The records were always there." He was quiet again. Then he said, in the tone of a man making a precise and cost-bearing statement, "The estate's legal arrangements will require revision." "They will," Eleanor said. "Mr. Fairweather has prepared a draft restructuring of the London instructions. He will have it ready by Friday." Lord Reginald nodded once. He looked at Tristan. He said, "You made a sound appointment." Tristan did not respond to this immediately. He was looking at Eleanor, and the quality of how he was looking at her was visible enough that Charlotte, beside Eleanor, made the quietest possible sound of satisfaction. He said, "Yes." Then he looked at Lord Reginald and said, "I made an excellent one." He took Eleanor's hand. It was not the gesture she had expected, and for a half-second she did not know what to do with it. His grip was deliberate and unhurried, his hand covering hers where she held the documents. He held it in front of Lord Reginald, in front of the investment circle, in front of 60 people, in a December assembly hall, who had now fully stopped pretending to pursue other conversations. He held it long enough that the room had time to understand what it was seeing. He said, to the room, in the carrying voice of a man who has decided to say something and will not hedge it, "Miss Voss has served this estate with more integrity and more intelligence than any arrangement I have previously made. I would ask you to treat her accordingly." The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment in which the social architecture of Derbyshire County recalibrated itself, stone by stone, at a speed that was appropriate to how it had been built. Charlotte Pierce exhaled. Fairweather, at the edge of the gathering, permitted himself a small and private expression that occupied the territory of vindication. Lady Sylvia Montrose stood at the far end of the room in her ivory silk, and she was not destroyed. She was simply, quietly, no longer relevant to what was happening. Eleanor looked at Tristan's hand over hers, and then at his face. She said, in a voice that did not require the room to hear it, "That was more public than I expected." "You deserved witnesses," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She pressed her free hand briefly against the side table, a steadying, and then she did not need steadying any more. He proposed 3 days later, in the estate office, at 7 in the morning, before the coal fire was properly lit. He stood on the far side of the desk, which was covered in Eleanor's annotated accounts, and he said, "I am going to propose to you, and I want to do it here, in this room, because this is where I understood what you were." Eleanor set down her pencil. He said, "Not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted to the requirements my position imposes, but because you see things clearly, and do not pretend otherwise, and because you play dussek in the evening, when you think no one is listening, and because you waited 40 minutes to straighten my cravat because you were finishing a calculation, and because those things are the same quality, and I find I cannot imagine this house, or this work, or any morning that is coming, without them." He paused. "Without you." Eleanor sat with this for the full, considered moment it deserved. She thought about all of it, the estate, the position, the gap between what she was by social definition and what he was asking her to become. She thought about £11 in a purse and a Latin grammar under a trunk lid. She thought about what her father had said about a woman who understood numbers, and she thought about the fact that she was sitting in an estate office with 12 years of accounts and a man who had read her draft letter and changed one word to make it stronger. She said, "Yes." He came around the desk. He did not kiss her, not then. There was time, and he moved through it without rushing. He took her hand, the way he had taken it at the assembly, deliberate and unhurried, and held it. Eleanor looked at his hand over hers, and at the annotated accounts around them, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was standing in the right room. They were married in February, in the parish church at the edge of the Ralston estate, in a ceremony witnessed by Fairweather, Charlotte, Rosie, who cried, which Eleanor had not expected, Whitmore, and 14 of the county families, who had come because of the assembly, and because the word had travelled, as it travels in county circles, about the accounts and the documents and the commission arrangement, and what Miss Voss had found. Lord Reginald attended. He sat in the second pew, and did not speak to Eleanor before the service, but as she passed him afterward, he said, in a low and exact tone, "My brother's estate is in better order than it has been in 20 years. It was not warmth, it was not an apology, it was a man looking at a record and reading it accurately, and Eleanor received it as such." The first spring at Ralston, Eleanor completed the restructuring of all 29 supply agreements that had been flagged in her initial survey. 19 of the 29 required renegotiation. The other 10 required documentation updates that had not been made in the original filing. By August, the estate's operational margin had improved by £430 annually, a figure she wrote in her ledger in her small, even hand, and which Whitmore copied into the estate records with the careful pride of a man who has been shown something important and is paying it forward. She established, in the second year, a formal record-keeping system for the tenant farms that gave each farmer a copy of the agreement and a copy of the relevant survey, because Eleanor had learned, from the wool merchant discrepancy in Wiltshire, from the Caldwell farm in Derbyshire, from 11 years of watching how information disappears when only one person holds it, that a document only protects the person it belongs to, if that person can read it. The tenant farmers read theirs. The disputes went down. The yields, documented accurately for the first time in many years, made the estate's planning substantially more reliable. Fairweather wrote her a letter in the spring of the third year, informing her that 3 neighbouring estates had requested copies of Ralston's account templates. He added, in his precise, unornamented hand, that this was in his experience an unusual occurrence, and that he found it entirely appropriate. She showed the letter to Tristan. He read it, set it on the desk, and said, he called it unusual. He said appropriate, Eleanor said. Both are high praise from Fairweather. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention that she had understood, some months into their marriage, was love, not the theatrical kind, but the working kind, the kind that shows up at 7 in the morning before the coal fire is lit, and stays until the accounts are done. He said, I expected something from him about the templates. He has been telling Whitmore for 2 years that they should be formalised. He told me in October, Eleanor said. I had been meaning to write them up since November. And you wrote them in December during the week I was in London. The house was quiet, she said. He looked at her. He was watching her with the settled, warm attention of a man who has made an arrangement he has no intention of revising, and Eleanor, who knew all the things this man's face was doing, understood that he was simply very glad she was in the room. Their son was born in the 3rd winter, on a cold morning in January, when the elms outside the bedroom window were frosted white, and the estate below them was entirely still. They named him James Arthur Vane, James for Whitmore, who had been the first person at Ralston to treat the work as real, and Arthur for Eleanor's father. He had dark hair, and Tristan's precise way of attending to things, which became apparent early, and Eleanor's habit of sitting very still when she was thinking, which Charlotte identified at 4 months old, with the exact expression of a woman who has been proven right about something she has been saying for some time. Charlotte came to Ralston every December and stayed until March, which was not the arrangement originally proposed, but had evolved into the only arrangement anyone found workable. She was the first person James reliably laughed at, and she accepted this honor with appropriate gravity. Rosie became the housekeeper in Eleanor's third year, a promotion Eleanor proposed to Tristan in writing, with 3 lines of reasoning and no extraneous material. He read it, wrote, agreed in the margin, and returned it. Eleanor filed it in the household administration folder that was now, after 3 years, a model of organizational clarity that she felt quietly and specifically proud of. Eleanor turned 32 in the spring, in the estate office, with James in the basket beside the desk, and Tristan reading correspondence across the table. James made a sound, and she reached one hand into the basket to settle him, and returned to the supply agreement she was reading, and was aware, the specific warm awareness of a life that is not merely being survived, but is being lived precisely as she had always known it could be, that Tristan was watching her. She did not look up. She knew he was watching. She had learned to know it the way she knew the sound of his step in the corridor, the way she knew when the coal fire needed building up, the way she knew the figure in the last column of any account she had spent enough time with. She finished the line she was reading, set the agreement aside, and looked across the table at her husband. He was watching her. He had been watching for a long time. He did not stop when she caught him at it. He never did. The Fenwick delivery agreement, she said. It needs a revised measurement clause before the autumn. I know, he said. I have a draft. I know that too, he said. Eleanor looked at him. James settled in the basket beside her. One small fist closed around the edge of the blanket. The coal fire burned steadily. The elms outside the window were beginning, at their very tips, the first suggestion of the season turning. Outside, Ralston Park, its accounts current, its agreements documented, its tenant farmers with copies of their own surveys, continued in the clear and properly maintained order that it had always deserved to be in. She opened the draft agreement. He pulled his chair closer to read beside her.